Welcome to another episode of Erik Whiskey Studies, and in this video, I'm going to talk about whiskey maturation, Scotch whiskey maturation. This is part of a series that I'm doing on Scotch whiskey production. Now, after distilling the new make spirit and then making the cuts, the spirit is then reduced to 63.5% alcohol by volume and placed in oak casks to mature for a minimum of 3 years. It may then be legally called Scotch whiskey. The maturation processes. 3 processes take place during maturation. First is the removal. The cask helps remove the aggressive new make spirit character. Second, addition. The spirit extracts flavor from the cask, such as the bourbon or wine, as well as wood characteristics of vanilla and spice. Third is interaction. The flavors from the wood and the spirit meld together to increase complexity. So age versus maturation. The 2009 Scotch Whisky Association regulations require that in order for a spirit to be labeled Scotch whiskey, it must be aged for at least 3 years in an oak cask, not exceeding 700 liters capacity in Scotland. The age of a whiskey is determined by the changes in the calendar. The maturation of a whiskey is determined by the changes in the spirit in the cask. The maturation of the spirit is determined by a number of different factors. First, the previous uses of the cask. Second, the quality of the cask. Third, the cask type. Fourth, the cask size. Fifth, the charring and toasting of the oak casks. 6, the warehouse type. 7, the warehouse climate. 8, the time in the warehouse. And 9, the cask finishing. So first, the previous uses of the cask. Is it a virgin oak? Is it first fill? Is it second fill? Now, just for a few definitions. If the cask has never had any spirit in it, it is called virgin oak. If it previously had a spirit in it, or a wine in it, and it's first time they're putting spirit into it, they call that first fill. So actually, the second fill, maybe the first fill technically, was bourbon, and now for the first time they're putting Scotch whiskey in it, they call that the first fill, because it's the first time they're putting something into it. By the way, I'm enjoying a little dram of the Smokehead Isla Single Malt Scotch Whiskey from Ian McLeod Distillers. Don't know what distillery this is, but it's bottled at 43% alcohol by volume, and I reviewed this a number of years ago. Best I could tell, based on the characteristic of the whiskey, I think this is much like Ardbeg, although because they don't say it, can't be for sure. It's a heavier peaty character than Bamor. It's more complex than I would say a typical Kalila. It's not as medicinal as a Laphroaig. It has some characteristics of an Ardbeg. To me, this comes across as the little brother of a Corryvreckan in terms of the character of the spirit, the smoke, the barbecue character, and the spice. It reminds me of Corryvreckan, just turned down a notch. It's about $25 cheaper than a Corryvreckan. So if you're looking for something with a Corryvreckan character, but not as expensive, this is a good option. Second, quality of the cask. Does the distillery have good sources for their casks? Are they selective in choosing casks? So one of the advantages of a distillery being owned by a larger conglomerate is a larger company, such as Beam Suntory or Diageo, is they have resources and they can get the quality cask. For example, Beam Suntory, all right? We're talking about Suntory, which is Japanese, which bought Beam in Kentucky, which also owns Bamor on Islay, and also owns Maker's Mark in Kentucky, and also owns Laphroaig. And they also own Auchentoshan in the lowlands and Glengarry in the highlands. So the cask that may have originated in Kentucky, either Maker's Mark or Beam, can then be used again at Bamor or at Laphroaig or it can make its way over to the lowlands, to Akadashan, or the highlands at Glengarry. So, because they have this tight association, being from the larger conglomerate of Beam Suntory, they have greater control of the quality of the cask. The other thing that can happen, particularly the larger distilleries, is they can have long-term relationships with bodegas down in Spain to make sure they're getting quality cask. A new distillery, which hasn't really made its way into the business, maybe doesn't quite have its foothold and doesn't have the network, maybe a little bit more challenged in getting quality casks. Cask types. In order to be labeled Scotch whiskey, the spirit must be matured in oak cask. The term oak refers to a tree or shrub of the genus Quercus. There are approximately 600 individual species that belong to this genus. There are 5 different subgenres. 1 is Quercus, which is white oak. 2, Labote, which is red oak. 3, Mesobalanus. 4, Cerus. And 5, Protobalanus. Only Quercus, white oak, is suitable for aging spirits. The other varieties of oaks either produce wood whose grain is too coarse and permeable for barrel making, or that contains such high levels of tannins in the wood that it would impart an unacceptable level of bitterness to the aging spirit. There are several subspecies of Quercus that are used for maturing whiskey. Quercus alba is an American oak cask which may be ex-bourbon cask or ex-sherry cask from Jerez, Spain. About 90% of all casks in Scotch warehouses are ex-bourbon casks. Chinkapin is a subspecies of Quercus alba. Contrary to the assertions of many whiskey experts, not all bourbons are aged in Quercus alba. For example, Buffalo Trace's distillery's the Charter Oak Straight Bourbon was matured in French oak. They also fail to mention the previous contents of the cask, which can have a greater impact on the aromas and flavors of a whiskey, as sherry is traditionally matured in Quercus alba. So it kind of drives me nuts when I hear or see someone referring to a Scotch whiskey as being aged in American oak, and they're not being specific about it being bourbon. Because if you just say American oak, that could mean bourbon, and it could mean ex-sherry, it could mean single malt, it could mean a whole lot of things. Also, by the way, there are distilleries that are aging their whiskeys in casks from Jack Daniels, which they don't want to be called a bourbon cask. They want to be called a Tennessee whiskey, and yet that distillery is saying their Scotch whiskey is aged in an ex-bourbon cask. And we're not going to get into the debate here as to whether or not Jack Daniels is a bourbon. Yeah, it classifies as a bourbon, but they don't want to be called that. Quercus robur is a European oak used to mature sherry as well as many wines. Oftentimes, a cask may be designated according to the region it came from, such as Spanish oak, when it is actually Quercus robur from France that was then used to mature sherry. Again, this is another issue that just kind of drives me crazy. Even some, well-known whiskey professionals saying, oh, this was probably aged in European oak because of the level of the spice that they think they're getting from the oak. And saying it's European oak doesn't do a whole lot of good if you're not getting more specific than that. We're talking Quercus robur. Also, if it's an ex-sherry cask, they may call it a European cask because Jerez, Spain, is in Europe. When in all actuality, the cask may be actually Quercus alba because it originated in the United States. But we're not going to get into it more than that. It's better to say this is an ex-bourbon cask because it used to contain bourbon, or it's an ex-sherry cask because it used to contain sherry, and you can get more specific whether it's Fino, Amontillado, Oloroso, Palo Cantado, or Pedro Jimenez sherry. But to simply call it American or European, it doesn't do the consumer much good. Quercus petraea. Quercus petraea is also known as Hungarian oak, Cecil oak, Cornish oak, Irish oak, Durmast oak, and it's a species of oak tree native to most of Europe. Quercus crispula, also known as Mizunara, also known as Japanese oak. It is native to Hokkaido, Japan's most northern prefecture. It is one of the most rare and expensive oaks in the world. So, Mizunara oak, or Quercus crispula, or is, and don't try to correct me if I'm mispronouncing this, it's a really unique oak that delivers a really unique spicy character. If you want to try out a Mizunara, I recommend the Glendalough Irish whiskey, 13-year-old aged in Mizunara. I think it's actually better than a lot of Japanese whiskeys aged in Mizunara. Mizunara has this really unique character, but one of the reasons why it's so expensive is because it's difficult to make cask out of it, and it's very porous. So, while it delivers some really unique characteristics to a whiskey, it's not the best container for holding on to the spirit. Cask sizes. The size of the cask has a significant impact on the rate of maturation. This is actually, I'm enjoying this more than what I remember. And I'm actually picking up a mint character on the finish that I don't remember picking up before. It actually has a better mouthfeel than I remember. It's 43%, but it doesn't feel thin. Unfortunately, looking at the color, it's probably got some E150 in it. Ardbeg doesn't use E150. That's the only thing that makes me say, maybe this isn't Ardbeg due to the color. So Ardbeg tend to be very light in color with a slight tinge of green, where this is, that typical tan root beer character. Unless they somehow have a sherry cask in there and the sherry notes just aren't being picked up. So you have quarter cask, bourbon barrels, hogsheads, and sherry butts. There are more casks in this. I'm just going to cover these because the other casks are fairly rare. A quarter cask is 1/4 of an American standard barrel and holds about 50 liters. Quarter casks are relatively uncommon and more expensive to use, but offer a greater degree of wood contact. Bourbon barrels. A bourbon barrel is approximately 190 to 200 liters. A bourbon barrel may be shipped from the United States intact or shipped as staves and then be rebuilt to be called an American standard barrel. It's the same thing. Hogsheads. A hogshead is approximately 250-liter oak barrel. Coopers break down 5X bourbon barrels into staves and reassemble them with new and larger heads. Hogshead casks are often used to age single malt whiskey, as they are large enough to hold the product of a single distillation run. In addition to their size and the type of wood they are made from, hogshead casks are also distinguished by their shape. They are typically longer and narrower than other types of whiskey barrels, which can help to concentrate the flavors of the whiskey as it matures. Sherry butts. A sherry butt is an approximately 500-liter cask. Sherry is a fortified, dry or sweet Spanish wine. There are several styles, including Fino, Amontillado, Oloroso, which is the most common, and Palacatado. Another is Pedro Jimenez, a very sweet sherry made from Pedro Jimenez grapes that are allowed to dry and become raisinated before being fermented. It is the sweetest and most viscous of all the sherries. It is intensely raisiny, syrupy, and dark. Globally, the popularity of sherry has declined, with the exception of the UK, which imports 29% of the world's sherry. Sherry butts are typically made from American white oak or Quercus alba, but they can also be made from French oak. Ex-sherry casks are sometimes referred to as Spanish oak. So if you see Spanish oak, that doesn't mean necessarily that it came from a Spanish forest. Charring and toasting oak casks. U.S. regulations require that bourbon casks be charred prior to being filled with spirit. Charring is only applied to the inner surface of the long side of the barrel. The tops and bottoms are not charred. A flame at a temperature of approximately 500 degrees Fahrenheit is applied to the inside of the barrel for a period ranging from 40 seconds to 1 minute. Some bourbon distilleries have experimented with charring times as high as 4 minutes. A typical charring results in the creation of a layer of charcoal approximately 1/8 of an inch thick. This is the depth mandated by U.S. regulations. The charcoal acts as an activated carbon filter, absorbing harsh, heavy compounds in the spirit, and provides a passage for the spirit into the pores of the oak. In addition, the charring caramelizes sugars in the wood. These are subsequently leached out by the alcohol in the spirit and add to the sweetness of the maturing bourbon. Although a significant amount of the benefit of the initial charring will have been used up by the first use of the barrel, there is still a measurable effect when it is subsequently reused for maturing Scotch whiskey. Typically, ex-bourbon casks are reused 2 to 4 times by Scotch distilleries. Since one of the primary functions of wood aging is to impart color to the spirit, color is used as an indicator of a barrel that has become exhausted. A tint meter is used to measure the color of the spirit before it is disgorged for blending. Barrels whose spirit lacks sufficient tint are deemed to have been exhausted. In this case, the spirit has been transferred to another barrel for additional aging. This is an expensive solution, so it happens rarely. It is better to manage the stock of casks appropriately and have an expectation of when exhaustion is imminent and preempt it. At this point, a barrel may be discarded and sold off for some other purposes, or it may be rejuvenated. All wood used in the construction of barrels has to undergo some degree of heat treatment in order to make an oak stay pliable enough to be bent into the required shape. Once a bourbon barrel has been made, it undergoes a second heat treatment or charring, while sherry casks are only toasted. The amount of toast applied varies from a light toast to a heavy char. Wood that had not undergone any such treatment would impart green, woody, and harsh tannic flavors to the maturing spirit. Each cooperage has their own particular range of wood treatments that they offer. These are then classified in terms of the temperature at which the heat treatment is applied and its duration. Barrels intended for aging wine usually carry a light, medium, or heavy toast. In some instances, they might carry an extra heavy toast, but the heat treatment stops short of actually charring the inner surface of the barrel. Barrels intended for spirit maturation undergo varying degrees of charring. There are generally 4 options offered. A number 1 char is the lightest and results from applying a flame for only about 15 seconds. A number 4 char, sometimes called an alligator char, for the resemblance of the texture of the wood to an alligator skin, is approximately 60 seconds. The number 2 and number 3 chars are each separated by an additional 15 seconds of time. Charring temperatures are usually around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Most bourbon producers use a number 3 or number 4 char. These are the ones that the Scotch whiskey industry utilizes for the maturation of the spirit. The heavier the char, the more pronounced the flavors of vanilla and caramel extracted from the cask and wood, and the darker the color of the maturing spirit. A lighter char will produce more sweetness and honeyed, that is, less caramelized flavors, and correspondingly lighter color. Some coopers are experimenting with using electric heating elements or microwaves to toast the wood. A slower charring process, like that achieved with electric heating elements, will produce a different flavor profile than the faster process using a flame, even if the degree of charring is the same. Cask rejuvenation. There are two general approaches that are taken with rejuvenation. In the first instance, the barrel can be disassembled, the charcoal layer scraped off, and reassembled, the barrel recharred. In some instances, a lighter charring than the one mandated by U.S. regulations for bourbon may be actually better for aging Scotch whiskey. Spirits aged in charred barrels mature faster and have a different taste and aroma profile than those aged in lightly toasted barrels. The second alternative is to take the existing barrel, minus the ends, the top and the bottom, and shave the inside off until the charcoal layer and approximately 2 millimeters of the underlying wood has been removed and new untainted wood has been exposed. The inside 2 millimeters just below the charcoal is where the conversion between the oak and the spirit take place. The shaved barrel is then again subjected to charring, after which it is then reunited with its original top and bottom. Compass Box, the British independent whiskey bottler, has experimented with toasting the heads of the barrels as well, in order to obtain additional maturation. It will cost between $50 and $100 to rejuvenate a cask, depending on the technique, versus roughly $200 for a used bourbon barrel. Rehabilitated barrels are not exactly the same as a new ex-bourbon barrel. However, they will produce a slightly different taste and aroma profile even if charred to the same degree. It's always a little bit of a gamble when we go with some of these labels. I did a whole series on Islay single malt Scotch whiskeys, in which I did a bunch of these indies. Some of them are worth it, some are not. You may see these at, say, at Total Wine and More. The Smokehead is one that I say I would recommend that they're worth checking out. Warehouse type. There are three types of warehouses for maturing Scotch whiskey. The first is the dunnage. The dunnage warehouse are the traditional style of whiskey warehouse. They're typically built of stone and have earthen floors. Barrels are stacked on top of each other 3 high. These warehouses tend to be damp and cool with less temperature variation than other types of warehouses. The volume loss, the so-called angel share, is less in this type of an environment, but the spirit will progressively lose strength over time. Racked warehouses. Racked warehouses are akin to traditional industrial warehouses. They are taller and drier and fitted with metal frames, allowing barrels to be stacked up to 14 high. These types of structures are modern versions of the traditional rickhouses used to age bourbon. These facilities can have significant temperature variation over the course of a year. More significantly, the position of the barrel and the temperature of the variations it experiences can vary significantly depending on where it is positioned in the structure. Barrels at the top of the structure will experience greater temperature variation and age much faster. The opposite is true for the barrels on the lower portion. The sweet spot is usually somewhere in the middle of the stack. Independent bottlers know from experience to sample barrels first when looking at the exceptional barrels for single malt offerings. In racked warehouses, it is advisable to rotate the relative position of the barrels over the course of their aging. Evaporation of water can be higher in racked warehouses, and the spirit can actually increase in alcoholic strength over time. So there are pros and cons to both dunnage and racked warehouse. Springbank has them both. The dunnage, the climate is a little different. You don't have as much angel share loss. However, typically they can only go 3 high, whereas as I just said, in a racked warehouse, they can go 14 high. So the cost of the space, in terms of real estate, you're going to save money by using in racked warehouses. So Springbank, when they needed more room, they put in a racked warehouse rather than another dunnage. Secondly, as I said before, the climate is going to be a little bit different, so your whiskey is going to mature a little bit differently. Also, with the racked warehouses, there's a convenience of being able to use forklifts and mechanized means of moving the casks around. However, let's admit it, when you're doing a tour, it's very cool to go into a dunnage warehouse. Just the atmosphere of it is quite something to experience. to smell the aromas and the flavors and perhaps taste a wee dram while touring the warehouse. Palletized. A palletized warehouse is identical to a modern industrial warehouse. The unit is shelved with large palletized bays that can be loaded and unloaded with a forklift. Whiskey barrels are placed upright, not on their side as in other warehouses, on a pallet, typically 2 to 6 depending on the size of the pallet, and then lifted by a forklift into a bay. Pallets are usually stacked 4 or 5 high. Again, pros and cons. Glen Scotia on Isla is using these. Raasay Distillery is using these. The advantage is it's easier to move a pallet with a whole bunch of barrels on it if they are vertical rather than laying down and then you put the banding around them. Of course, then you have to put your bunghole on the top rather than on the side. So advantage, you can move them around fairly well and they don't take up as much space because you don't have the space in between as much as you do with the rack warehouse or the dunnage warehouse. The disadvantage is if you have a pallet, you have a bunch of barrels on it, and then it's got a band around it to hold them together. If one of them should leak and it's in the middle of the pallet, now you got to take the pallet down, remove all the barrels to try to find which ones is actually leaking. So there's always pros and cons to everything in life, and the distiller has to make a choice. Is it going to be worth it to use a rack? Is it going to be worth it to put them vertical, or have they got the room in the den space to make them all dunnage? Choices that have to be made, and they have to work it out what's going to work out best for them. Warehouse climate. A whiskey in a warehouse in Scotland will mature more gradually in Scotland than in Texas. The temperature and fluctuation of the temperature of the warehouse will affect the way in which the spirit engages with the cask. Warehouse humidity also influences the role played by wood. High humidity causes a decrease in alcohol strength, whereas dry, low humidity warehouses have the opposite effect. Extraction of vanillin is better at low humidity, resulting in spirits with a more pronounced vanilla aroma. Warehouse temperatures affect the oxidation that takes place in the spirit. Higher temperatures speed up these reactions, an unwanted effect. Higher temperatures result in more evaporation, especially of water, thereby increasing the ABV, whereas lower temperatures reduce the overall evaporation but increase the proportion of alcohol being evaporated. Moreover, the wider the range of temperature in a warehouse, the faster the spirit will mature and the more pronounced the effect of the wood on the spirit. So if you have a greater diurnal range throughout the year between highs and lows, the highs of summer and the lows in the winter, you're going to have much more engagement with the wood. This is why maturation in Texas has to be managed very differently than in Scotland or, say, in Kentucky. Kentucky has similar ranges and temperatures as Texas. Texas, though, is typically even more extreme. So it's not that a whiskey will age faster in Texas or in Kentucky. It's rather that certain elements will mature faster while other elements are not. So you have a different type of cask management going on in these more inclement regions. So they may actually have to move the spirit into different casks because you don't want necessarily the entire few years a couple years that it's in to be just in one cask because it'll extract too much and become overly tannic. I could talk more about that, but then we'd be talking more about American single malts and bourbons than we are about Scotch whiskey. Warehouse time. While a hotter climate may increase the maturation of some elements of the spirit, it cannot mature all elements of a whiskey. The youth of a spirit can only ultimately be mitigated by time in the cask. Scotland's moderate climate means that it has the advantage of maturing a spirit more evenly over time than a more extreme climate such as Kentucky, India, or Taiwan. Cask finishing. Cask finishing is also common in which a spirit is aged for the majority of the time, say in a bourbon cask, say 10 to 12 years is common, and then it undergoes a second aging in another cask, usually a wine cask such as a red wine, a white wine, Madeira, port, sherry, and so forth. So there is still much more that could be said about maturing of Scotch whiskey, but I think we've covered all the basics. In this series, I want to go more in depth than what you would get at a distillery tour, but not so far in depth that you feel like you need a degree in chemistry to know what I'm talking about. All right, that's it for this video. I want to recommend, if you have not already, watch the previous videos in the series and watch the video that is linked after this one. All right, until next time, Slanja. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.